Esoteric psychology. The idea of esoteric psychology, and its distinction from Western psychology, lies in the fact that it does not regard someone as being conscious. Esoteric psychology regards us as being in a state of sleep, in which everything happens, a state in which we imagine that we are conscious, a state in which we imagine that we have will, in which we are convinced that we have a permanent ego, and in which we imagine that we can do. Esoteric psychology teaches that all this is illusory, and that people attribute to themselves what they do not possess. The first stage of our beginning to assemble such attributes belongs to the shock at point 6 that we have spoken about from different angles. Some assume that a shock simply means a sudden unpleasant experience, and certainly some shocks are of this nature, and therefore become particularly useful. However, a broader concept of this shock at point 6 is necessary, and it is here that a whole change in outlook, an entire change of mind comes into play which shatters our former selves into a million pieces. We really need to understand what it means that things for us are not as they seem. To understand that we and others are asleep, that none of us can really do, that we have no real will of our own, nor any real permanent ego, and so on. The realization of all this is a shock, both gradual and at times sudden. In an earlier stage of this teaching, a particular definition of self-remembering, as the realization of our mechanicalness, was given. When we begin to realize that it is not we who do, but it that does, then we have a taste of a certain kind of self-remembering. However, understand that if we cannot in any way separate ourselves from ourselves, then we will never grasp what it means to realize our mechanicalness. We will call everything I, and this is just one of the greatest sins that we commit against ourselves and against others. We really are legion, but take ourselves as one, then behave toward other people as if each of them were one. When we observe ourselves uncritically and sincerely, over an extended period of time, we begin to notice how much we are mechanical, and notice that we can scarcely say, "It is I who do this, but it was it which did that." Notice that you consent to it, and as it were, call it I, although this is not a conscious process, but a kind of self-justifying that goes on in the background, and makes everything seem to be in order, so that we believe that everything going on is I. For example, there is inner talking going on in us, and we go along with it just as if it were us doing it, but really these I's which are talking and saying things to us are doing it all in our name, or rather we are believing that they are us. Then, quite suddenly, a more conscious I, a work I might say to us, "Why aren't you in the work?" Everything changes completely at that point, the talking stops suddenly, and the I's that were doing it all run away and hide. We cannot give ourselves the shock at point 6 if we always go about our own way, or at least try to go our own way. Because to go our own way is to remain asleep, to remain mechanical, to remain a machine. When we have our own way, when things go smoothly, we are not going against ourselves, and we are not conscious. When two things cross, we get a slight moment of consciousness. We wake up a little, for that moment. If you never put the work in opposition to life, you will have no cross, and no friction in a larger sense, because the work and life go in different directions, and this cross is not comparable with the little crosses that life produces, that come and go each day, that we deal with in our own life way. These are a quite different kind of cross. Once they begin to be formed in us, once they remain in us and are felt all the time, though we know that we cannot have our own way, sometimes more distinctly, and sometimes less distinctly, but we know it all the same, and know that if things seem easier, we cannot delude ourselves into imagining that this is what we actually want. The reality of the work becomes a greater reality than the realities of life. When things are easier in life, when one begins to make friends with life for a time, it does not shut out the presence of the work behind us. Life can grant us ease, and the work can give us respite, however they are different in taste. All this refers to the first conscious shock, that we have to know the difference between being asleep and being awake through inner taste, before we even begin to know how to give this shock. If we are identified with life, then we are in life. We respond only to A influences. We are in all the feelings that life gives, we are in all its anxieties, and will be far away from this work. The work will seem like a dream. We will be far away from any possibility of giving ourselves the shock at point 6. We need to reinterpret life and see it in the light of this work. However, as long as we are completely in life eyes and absorbed in the cares, anxieties, frictions and ambitions of life, we cannot expect to interpret and to experience life differently. Only work eyes can do this. Life eyes know only one language, that of life, but work eyes know two languages, that of life and that of the work. Were this not the case, then what hope would there be for humanity, save that of serving the machinery of organic life? The purpose of great nature. How could we separate ourselves from ourselves if there were nothing in us that was different from that which we call the self? How, if we think that we are one, could we separate into the observer and the observed? Here enters another aspect of that shock at point 6. It consists of always trying to surrender chief valuation to work eyes during difficult periods. Trying to obey what the work says in any particular situation. Think through how it might feel to act in a work way, to obey what we perceive and visualize ourselves doing. Of course we would have to remember the work, what it teaches in order to be able to do this. That is why it's so important to get to know about the work, really to study it, to make an effort to understand its teaching, then keep it alive, center stage in our mind, remembering to seek new connections. Returning then to an earlier definition of self-remembering, as the realization of one's own mechanicalness. When we find ourselves talking in some typical way, we realize that we are talking from a particular attitude associated with one or two archived recordings. We're playing a role and reading a script, just as an actor does on the stage. We know it's not so difficult to see these playbacks in other people, once the idea of them has been pointed out. It is more difficult, however, to see those rehearsed reactions playing out in ourselves, and to catch them at work. We can recognize them nonetheless later on, through a certain taste and by an inner feeling of loss of force. Whenever we think mechanically or feel mechanically, we tend to lose force. When we become more aware of these stereotypical archives, both of the kind that we express through outwardly spoken words, and the sort that run inside us internally, directing our chains of thought, then we begin to understand something of what mechanicalness lies ingrained deep within us. Of course we will not if we justify, if we find some reasons that are sufficient for us to account for speaking outwardly or inwardly as we are speaking. Whenever we find ourselves saying the same things again and again, this is being mechanical. When we become aware of mechanicalness of this kind, the illusion of the self begins to be destroyed. An interesting struggle takes place which can be described as an experience that everyone must go through, and which everyone will inevitably meet at a certain stage, if they work on themselves. This illusion of oneself must be broken into, before the shock at point 6 can really be given. If we try to give the shock when we are filled with the illusion of self that we have always had, then we will not be able to become more conscious, but on the contrary will tend to drift even further into sleep. We have to realize our position. Remember the story of the rope and the precipice? Someone is quite unaware of either, then they notice the precipice and realize their true position, then observe the rope above their head. Understand what this allegory means. We do not want the rope until we see the danger, and do not perceive the threat as long as we are in the illusion that everything is going just fine. In the same way, a person in the illusion of themselves, a person in something not as yet torn asunder, will make no right effort of self-remembering, because just as the precipice remains unnoticed, then so does the rope. That rope is the work. The rope is esotericism which lies just above us, but on a higher level. The healing influences of esotericism can reach us in the third state of consciousness, but not in the second state. Hence the first conscious shock is to raise us to that self-consciousness, the forms of awareness, the kind of light that belong to the third state. Reflect upon why it is said that the realization of one's mechanicalness is a form of self-remembering. It means that we begin to become aware of the danger we're in, because what we have taken for granted in ourselves, we begin to see as illusion. We begin to see that we do not really exist, such as we imagine we are anyway. Once this illusion of the self begins to be broken, it becomes possible to feel the influence of the work not only reaching, but guiding us. If, on the other hand, we are convinced that the present pattern of ourselves is right, it naturally becomes difficult to work on the self because there is no private reason why we should. Where's the motivation? If we feel no lack, if we sense no shortfall, then how can we work? If we feel that we really have lost nothing, how can we seek, or even want to begin a search of some kind? If we feel that we already know, then how can we be taught? If we are fundamentally satisfied with ourselves, and everything is just fine as it is, then how can we change the self? Why should we?